So my name is Seth. This is my first meeting as well. I know some of you from past and present jobs, so it's good to see you guys here. But for a lot of you, I am just seeing you for the first time, so hello.
Hi.
Yeah, actually, from now on, maybe I'll recognize more of you at the conferences, because I'm sure a lot more of you were at B-sides than I recognized at the time. So previously, I was on the defensive side of security. I was a security engineer at the Symantec SOC for 5 years. Did a lot of IDS and firewall engineering. After a while, I wanted to learn more about the offensive side, so particularly web application security. And that's what I'm doing now. I mean, I really love it. Not only do I look at web apps, but I look at thick clients, some wireless and some infrastructure assessments as well. So I switched over to application security to learn more about the offensive side of the industry. At some point, I definitely plan on moving back to the defensive side. I've always loved that, the idea of catching the bad guys. I'm just doing it in a slightly different way now, but I do plan on going back at some point. My other interests, gardening, cooking, woodworking. If any of you guys are into any of that stuff, feel free to come say hi. So I just, before I get too far into it, I just wanted to see with a show of hands who has used Burp before, who's familiar. Excellent. Oh, that. So that's great. So I will go through a quick intro and get right into some of the things that I find just the most fun. I have a good amount of time to do a web application assessment at my current place of work. But there are always some things that you like looking for the first day of the assessment, and that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. Maybe some of you look for the same things. My hope is that you'll find a few new tricks. So, and I know a lot of you probably have really strong areas of expertise, and might work with Burp every once in a while. So this maybe will take you to just slightly the next level. So the two things that I wanted to talk about. So I'll be talking about things not cross-site scripting, not SQL injection. Mostly access control issues, things that an automated scanner is not ideal to pick up on. Well, you guys are all familiar with Burp, so you know that it's really inexpensive compared to some of the $10,000, $20,000 scanners that are out there. So the intro, here is a web page. Here is what happens behind the scenes when you refresh that web page. So multiple requests. I wanted to quickly mention that there are GET requests, which means that everything that is being requested is in the URL. And then there are POST requests where same type of thing, you're just requesting some items in the body of the message as well, so you wouldn't necessarily see them in the URL itself. So here is an intercepted request for those of you that are new to Burp. You can choose to run a tool like Burp or any other, Fiddler or Zap in interception mode on. You'll intercept every single request, or you can run it and intercept mode off. I do most of my work with intercept mode off, and I use the additional tools, particularly the intruder, the repeater, the decoder, and the compare, and that's some of the stuff I'll show you today. Before I go much further here, how many of you use CWE or have? Okay, so CWE, this is a MITRE project, common weakness enumeration. I have found it really helpful in talking about weaknesses to the customer, to developers. It's kind of like, well, so here's a good example. I might call what I'm going to talk about next account enumeration. Somebody else might call it account harvesting. CWE calls it response discrepancy information exposure. Whether that's the best way to say it or not, it doesn't really matter. I'm relying that it's common, it's something that people respect, the MITRE effort there. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is some tricks, some you might know, some you might not have seen, to determine whether an account exists on a web application. So here's just a login form for utility company. Oh yeah, I put that in there for myself. I will use a bunch of different screenshots from different applications, so I don't want, when I was doing a dry run, somebody made the comment it was kind of confusing because I was showing different examples, but they're not the same application. So this one is from a utility company. The next one might be from just a completely different application. So when I put in an account that exists to that form, I get a JavaScript pop-up here that says you've provided an invalid password. I'm sorry, when I use an account that exists, I get something that says you provided an invalid password if I have in fact provided an invalid password. And I'm doing that on purpose. Account exists, invalid password. The next time I use that form, I will then use an account that I know doesn't exist, and it really doesn't matter what password I use. And you can see visually these are different. That's all you need to determine whether the account exists on the application or not. And you can iterate through a list of known usernames, known email addresses, things like that. So the first thing, well, a lot of web applications do not do that first step. But the ones that do, they get their login page squared away. Another place to look is the forgot your password function. So sometimes the first page is great, but you go and the same exact vulnerability exists on your forgot your password page. In here you can see this application. When my account did exist, it asked me my security question that it knew. When the account did not exist, it gave me an error. Same way, iterate through them, record which account exists, which accounts do not exist. So I raised that vulnerability to this particular vendor, and this is how they fixed it. But it's not perfect yet. Can anybody see how I can still determine, how I can still infer when the account exists and when the account does not exist? Excellent. So now here's an example. I talked about my hobbies. While the utility company was still having trouble with account enumeration, here's my gardening website, the website I use to log my gardening updates. I planted the carrots today. They do it right. Both the account exists, the account does not exist, the message, the visual is identical. However, if you use the Burp comparer and you send both requests, so the two post requests, to the comparer, you'll see you're going to look for differences. Now, this is the top portion of the comparer. You can see the scroll bar is at the top of each of those screenshots. What I wanted, I included this slide to show you that not everything that has changed means that the account exists or does not exist. Doesn't give you that inference that you need. So the date changed because you requested the second, or I requested the second request 7 seconds later. But if you scroll down on this same page, you see here there are two. Now this is really subtle, but what's nice about Burp is that it shows you that key. It highlights everything for you. So modified, added, deleted, and you can see that in the example on the left, the username passed validation, but the password failed validation. And you can see in the other example that the username failed validation, so it didn't even check the password. So this is, my whole point in showing you this is that it's not just visual. Any code, I've seen it where there's white space that's different between two. I've seen it where you see a random BR, tag in there. That's all you need.
So I got a question.
Yes, please.
Depending on the site, that may or may not be a good thing that you want the username to come back. So if I'm trying to log into Google and I pick a I may want to know that I actually had an account, because if I haven't logged in there for 6 months,
right?
Oh shoot, did I have an account? I don't want to end up with like 20 accounts on the same site that I've forgotten my username, and now I'm like. So I may want to come back and say, hey, there's no username like that, or there is a username like that. So it may depend on the account that you may want to come back. Otherwise, you end up, the site ends up with 20 dead, user accounts per person.
Right. No, it's a really good point. And my tagline on the section header was, by helping the users, you're helping the attackers. So it's risk that you have to weigh. Google is an example. Actually, I had a slide right after this one that said. Google is a great example. They tell you the code visual, it's identical. So it's a choice. And that's why, again, why the CWEs really help. It speaks the developer language in a lot of cases, and it helps more people than just the security assessment team to understand the risks. But that's a very good point. So this slide's been up for a second. So this is just really a recap. When you're recommending a fix to developers, those top two cases need to respond identically. And these are some of the things we've looked for. Oh, yes, please. Thank you.
If you're allowing random users to create accounts, aren't you always allowing enumeration? Because if you're making a new account, you're always going to check it against things that already exist. Like the account creation page, right?
Yeah.
And especially
Yeah.
email.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. In my day job, I mostly work with websites that do not allow account creation. But that's a very good point. Sip of water. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about, and this is really what I have the most fun doing, is iterating through parameters. So not injecting code into parameters, JavaScript, SQL injection, or SQL statements, JavaScript, things like that. But when I go and looking at an application, and the application supports file download or file upload or a lot of other things, if I see a URL in my Burp history that looks like this, that's a red flag for me. That says I want to now, okay, my file that I uploaded was 1320, but what if, or sorry, the file that I upload and the one that I'm trying to download right now is 1320, and I get the file, my file. What happens if I do 1319? Do I get the file that somebody else previously uploaded right before me? And a lot of times, a lot of times this is vulnerable. Here's another example, file ID 208, different application. I was able to iterate through, and I'll show you in the next slides the process. And I just wanted to use this one. I actually cut this down. It's not always as obvious as ID equals or file equals. This was a very long, this is a GET request, but it was a very long GET request. Look for, knowing that technique is one thing, but keeping your eye sharp for things like this. Again, something a scanner is not going to be able to understand whether that file is one of the ones that you uploaded, a couple of days earlier. So here is one where you have an account ID and a doc ID. So, okay, I'm iterating through the documents. Maybe the doc ID, from my account, that's fine. But now I can try iterating through the account ID and the doc ID as well. Get documents from other accounts. So for those of you who have not done this before, not seen something like this before, you send the request from your history to the Burp intruder. You highlight the position or positions that you want to iterate through. So in here, the number 208. And you set your payloads. In all the examples I'm going to use today, they're going to be numbers. But just keep in mind that numbers are not the only thing you want to iterate through, right? It could be usernames, it could be letters, it could be anything. So numbers, I always go off of the request that I saw. So 208, I'm going to start from 0 to 500. I'm going to try to download every single one of those files. Here's my results. As it's running, the payload will be sequential, most likely if you ran your scan sequentially. So what I do is I will either sort by the length or I'll sort by the status, and that's usually how I can kind of group, my bounty. So here is an Excel spreadsheet that I definitely did not have access to see. And in Burp, you just right-click and you do Save to File, and there's your spreadsheet. Any questions so far? Okay. Feel free to interrupt me. So here's another one. It has nothing to do with file download. This is account info. This was actually a thick client written in C# that interacted with web services on the back end using SOAP. And so you can see up there, I show you my session ID. And you see the method is account get, highlighted in yellow on the bottom of the screen. So my account, when I requested info about my account, it's 86. So immediately I see that, and that's what my message is. If you see something like that, anything that might be iterable, try 85, try 84, try 1 to 300. So this is 84, not me. Now this is has a whole host of other vulnerabilities, but iteration is how I found it. So it's telling me the first name, the last name, the last 10 passwords hashed, because that's how it was. That's how it was choosing to check if you're reusing the last 10 passwords. And most importantly, to me in this case, the session ID of that user. So if that user had a valid session, thank you.
So just out of curiosity,
yes.
that hatch of the password,
yeah.
It looks like just straight basics didn't work.
It was not, unfortunately. I mean, it is the first round base 64, but it was more of something else, yeah.
But that's awesome. It gave you the most recent active valid session ID that
yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and everybody else. Yeah, right. Yeah.
You looked up.
Yeah. So here is another example. Now this one, I just wanted to include, your eye should immediately go to the login name, the parameter, iterable. This was another one where this one was unauthenticated. So here I put in the username, and if that username existed, it gave me this page. Again, full name, employee ID, email address, a nice handy link to the birth certificate of that user in the up images directory, which is not protected from unauthenticated users. So, I mean, that's why I'm calling it my favorite. These are the things that once you find it, it's like crack. You're like, please be this dumb, for your next assessment. So the recommendation, enforce your server-side access control checks on every server-side function. The developer made an assumption that nobody would change that ID because that ID was provided by the code, right? I intercepted it and then replayed it later in Burp. Okay, so I wanted to go through a few client-side control bypasses. So here is a pop-up that I received. It's a file upload function. I attempt, you see a file upload function on a website. What do? You try to upload a web shell. You try to upload a malicious file of something. So say I uploaded a PHP file in this case, and it said, oh no, it needs to be a PDF. If you see something like this, remember this is JavaScript that's being pushed to the client. That doesn't mean they're enforcing this on the server as well. So here's a good time for those of you who are not as familiar with Burp. By default, if you turn intercept on with Burp, it will intercept all of your requests going out, and then it won't intercept the responses coming back. You can enable that on a per request basis, or just right here you can say turn on all, intercept all the responses temporarily for everything that's in scope. And this is what you get. Coming back from the page is a JavaScript function, validate form, and it reads the file name. If the last 4 characters of the file name are not PDF, it gives you that nice JavaScript alert that we saw, and it returns false for the validate form function. How do you bypass this? You just remove that. Or change it to, in a lot of different ways, right? You could change PDF to PHP. You can, change it to true.
Burp also has a feature to match and replace. So in the response, if you see return equals false, you can just have it automatically change it to return equals true based upon a regular expression. So you won't even see it. You'll just bypass it altogether.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. So, and there's another way. Editing your responses as they come back to your browser is one way. Another way, the first way that I learned how to do it was make your upload fit the the format of the JavaScript. So just name your malicious, PHP file PDF, then intercept it with Burp on the way out, change the file name back to PHP, and then it bypasses the validation. I tend to go with the first way now. I just wanted to show this as another example. So here's another thing. Burp has actually an option to undisable any disabled tags, but it's a code match, so it doesn't always work. This is just an example to get you guys thinking about anytime you see something that looks like it's a security control enforced on the client. Check that, verify that. Look at your code. So here the all 3 buttons are grayed out. This is done with a tag, an HTML tag, disabled equals disabled. If your response coming back, if you just remove the disabled equals disabled, you get your approve button. And now, sometimes you'll get the approve button, but you still won't, the code wasn't returned by the server to tell the approve button what to do. But if you're lucky, they did send that back. The server is not validating that you really don't have access to approve it, and you're golden. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, that was kind of introductory for the people that have done web app assessments. A few tricks that I've used, actually one trick that I've used in intercepting traffic from thick clients. Number one, it's not impossible. Most thick clients use HTTP, and this trick applies to those thick clients that use HTTP. Now, they might use web services, or they might use something else inside of the HTTP, but if they are using HTTP, Burp can proxy it. Now, if they're not, you can look at tools like Mallory, and there's other ones. Echo Mirage, used to work, but for me. Okay, so if your client, your thick client, there's a Java program, a C# program, is proxy aware, that's great. You just set your IE settings or your OS specific proxy settings, and your thick client will respect that proxy setting. Then that's great. If your client is not proxy aware, so you can't get it to go through Burp, use your local host file, and I'll show you. I'm going to walk through this example next. You're setting up Burp in invisible mode, and you're redirecting the traffic to your local host, and I'll show you how to set that up with Burp. The last example, this is trickier, but there are a lot of ways to do it, is if your thick client is not using fully qualified domain names, you can't mess with resolution to get your traffic to Burp. Just use a layer 2 or a layer 3 to technique to man in the middle of that traffic. This is what a lot of the mobile applications need to do, things like that. Okay, so for approach number 2, this is the most common that I've seen. Your thick client uses FQDNs. So find the domain name, use Wireshark, TCP dump, whatever you need, or just host to get the IP address. Now map that domain to localhost, and that's what sends it to Burp. Now Burp has to listen. So remember, we're not using proxy settings, which kind of nice and politely changes 443 traffic to 8080 or whatever you're using. So what you have to do is you have to set your listener up on the port that is being spoken by that thick client. So this is the last step. If you do that, you'll be able to see the requests, but Burp won't know what to do with them. Burp will then try to send them also to 127.0.1, your loop packet, it'll be a loop. So what you're doing here is an options connection, the last piece of the puzzle. You're telling Burp that IP address that it needs to go out to. Burp is your resolver just for these two domain, or this domain and the subdomain. And that's it, I'm done. These are some of the resources that I've used to learn about application security. Kind of out of order, the podcast by Jim Manico for the OWASP project were just really great beginning resources. Then I read the Hacker's Handbook. David Studdard is the one who, and Marcus Pinto, David Studdard is the one who writes Burp. Excellent book, volume 2's out now. I'm sure almost everybody in this room does this on a regular basis, but exploit database, download the vulnerable web application, fire it up in a VM, and recreate the exploit yourself. Spot the vuln. This one is actually, this site's not up currently, but I hit up Billy, and he said he might bring it back up in the future. You can see it on the Wayback Machine. The concept could be recreated by anybody. On Monday, he would find an open source project that patched a security bug, and he'd post the vulnerable code pre-patch on Friday, and then it was an exercise for the reader to, what's wrong. And then on Friday, he would post the post-patch code, and that's how they fixed it, or sometimes he would say they fixed it, but they didn't really fix it. So it was an amazing resource, and I'd like to thank my team at Blue Canopy. It's a great team, and still learning every day. Thank you very much. Yes? Get out of here all day. Me, email me. By the way, I just presented this on a Surface RT. I hate this thing, but it actually worked for this. So don't buy a Surface RT, but if you have one, it works with PowerPoint.